Welcome to the Rebel Rise podcast, a place where badass women like you come to connect, learn, and grow. Here, we celebrate the relentless spirit of women who dare to dream and design their own destinies. This is your time for no bullshit, so no subject is off limits. This is a time for you to collect inspiration and create the vision for your life. Get ready to break free from societal expectations, take your power back, and step into your dream life. Your empowerment journey begins right here. Let's go. Okay, so today on Rebel Rise, we have the amazing Coach Ellen on the podcast. Coach Ellen is a burnout and stress coach, and she and I connected a couple of years ago now on social media via Instagram, and I've just been watching her do her thing, and she's absolutely crushing it, which makes her the perfect guest for Rebel Rise. So I want to just start by saying, Ellen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I was literally just realizing earlier today how long we've been connected on Instagram. So I'm very happy to finally be able to chat with you in real time, if not in real life.
Yeah, I know it's been a while. It's been a couple of years. I was a new coach and I started in the burnout space. And so I just kind of crept into your DMs and was like, hey, I want to know about your business and how things are going. And my mentor had me do that. I'm still working with my mentor today. So it's kind of fun. This is like full circle and I love it. But Ellen, will you start by just telling everybody a little bit about you, your origin story, and how you came to be what you are now?
Yeah, my origin story. So whenever people ask me this question, I always feel like I have to throw it back to, at the very least, like when I was in high school. Like if I think back to how I got to where I am today, it's very, very much driven by who I was back when I was a teenager. And who I was somebody who was an exceptionally externally validated human. Like I was constantly looking for people to tell me I'm doing a good job. Like in whatever way it was, I just thrived off of external validation, with sports, with academics, with the things that I was doing for extracurriculars. It was just all like, tell me I'm doing a good job. Give me that gold star. I want your external validation from my parents to all the like adult figures in my life. I just wanted that external validation. And so naturally I was like a super overcommitted, like really, really busy teenager. Did all the things, played on like multiple soccer teams in the same season. Like it was crazy. And so I feel like what happens for a lot of us is, we maintain that, that external validation seeking. I did it again in college. I was once again chasing the tell me I'm doing a good job in college. I was busy and overcommitted in college. I actually vividly remember fall of my senior year, the guy I was dating at the time, we actually broke up because I was basically just like a robot and I had no life. And I was just, it was bad. So I was like taking like 400 level classes. I was TAing, I was assistant soccer coaching, I was working 20 hours a week in a lab. I was like just doing everything. And so I kept continuing that, like, tell me I'm doing a good job. I'm going to do all of the things so that I can get this external validation. And then I hit graduate school and I feel like everybody hits a point where the things that they were doing and the way in which they were operating was no longer working. And that was graduate school for me. I like hit a wall in graduate school. It was just like burnout in all of its different forms, emotional exhaustion, mental exhaustion, physical exhaustion, all the things. And I finally realized I needed to operate differently. And honestly, in the path of trying to figure out how to act differently, how to think differently, shift my mindset, just grow myself as a human, I found coaching. And I always say coaching threw a monkey wrench into my life because I was in science. I was getting my PhD. I was going to be Dr. Ellyn. And then I found coaching and I was just like, shit, I love this so much better than I love science. And I feel like that was the moment where I started to really question the path that I'd been on. And till that point, I just kind of been taking, what's the next logical step? What's the next logical step? What's the next thing that's going to get me that validation that I love and that's going to have people tell me that I'm doing a good job? And I finally hit that point where I was just like, other people's validation is no longer worth what it's costing in terms of my own fulfillment. And that was when I decided to drop out of my PhD. My parents loved that. I dropped out of my PhD and I literally dropped out with the intention of going into coaching and starting my own coaching business, which is such a crazy shift for so many people. Like a lot of people in my life were just kind of like, really? Like, good for you. Like, good for you for doing your own thing, but like, really? And yeah, I had to kind of figure this whole thing out. And I wish I could say that like burnout stopped in graduate school, but it didn't, because I feel like so many entrepreneurs, you trade your 9 to 5 for, a 24/7. And that's kind of what I did. I was like living and breathing and so passionate about the stuff that I was doing, but I had no off switch. And so even in pursuing entrepreneurship, I had to do some of the same things. I had to stop looking to other people to drive my business forward and tell me how to grow my business, and just start looking at myself and what fulfilled me and what kind of business I wanted to create. So it's been a whole like twisted, crazy journey, but I went from being Dr. Ellen, or at least about to be Dr. Ellen, to being Coach Ellen. And it's been so, so fun, because I feel like all of my different passions and all the things that I've been dabbling in over the course of my life come together under the realm of burnout. And I think that's why I love it so much. So I coach, I speak, I do all the things now. And I am Ellyn. I am Coach Ellen. I am Ellyn, the burnout coach now, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I love it. And, in us chatting together over the years, and really over the last, I don't know, month, as we were planning
Mm-hmm.
getting together for this, like we've realized that there's so much in common that we have. And even just like listening to your story, I'm like, oh, yeah, overachiever in high school, check. Like multiple extracurriculars, check. Like I was in sports med, I was in theater, I was also
Same.
on soccer team the first half of high school, and then I did cheer, and like I did so many different things. And I also really resonate with what you just said about how it's like all of a sudden you get to put everything into coaching, and it's like all of these
Mm-hmm.
things that you always loved, which is interesting. And so like
Yeah,
for me, like being able to do this podcast or speaking on stage, it's like my theater roots. And at one point I wanted to be an
exactly.
actor, and I also started in medical too. When I was in
Mm-hmm.
college, I wanted to be a forensic anthropologist, and I could still nerd out on that all day long. But it was
Same.
also like there was just like this part of me that was like, oh my God, this is so much school for like so little guarantee. Because for forensic anthropology, at least at the time, you had to like write this huge dissertation and be accepted into be inducted into their society. And then there were, I think,
Mm-hmm.
48 actual practicing forensic anthropologists for the entire
Oh my
nation. And I was
gosh.
like, well, and of course, as an achiever, I'm like, well, screw it. Like I could do that. Like, of course I can,
Yeah.
like no problem. But then I was like, well, if the alternative is me having to work in academia and becoming a professor, I didn't want to do that. And so
That
I
was
got
a big
stuck in.
question that I asked myself too. Is I was just like, let's look up the ladder is what I used to call it. And I actually
Mm,
like the lifestyles that I see. And like it didn't, that wasn't factoring into, are those people happy? Those people might have been completely happy, but I looked up the ladder and I saw lifestyles that I didn't want. I
yeah.
didn't want to be an academic. Even though, and I think that's where the following your path of what you're good at for a really long time can start to get you into trouble. Is I was really good at what I was doing, but I didn't want the life of an academic. I didn't want the life of a researcher. I didn't want the life of science and constantly having to write for grant money to be able to do my work. I just didn't want that lifestyle. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, it took me several years into my PhD program for me to realize, shit, I don't actually want this life.
Yeah. When you're a young adult, they teach you like you've got to grow up, you've got to pick this career. And so this is kind of where my shtick as a coach comes into play, is like coming back to your inner child and like figuring out like what do you want to do? Because when you
Mhm.
have all that programming being plugged into your head, like you got to go be a doctor or a lawyer, you got to pick a big girl job, and you've got to go do this thing. Especially as an achiever, we kind of shove off to the side all of those things as a child that we enjoyed. And so it's interesting, and I love bringing that out in people and bringing that
Mhm.
out in my clients, these things that we've kind of forgotten, right? And so I
Yeah.
think it's interesting in our own journeys how we've kind of circled back to like, oh well, now as a coach, and I'm not plugging everybody should be a coach, like it's not for everybody, but like now we get to like play and do these things. And I used to get in trouble for talking all the time too. Well, now I talk to people all day every day, right? And that's what makes me a good
Yeah.
coach too. So it's just interesting how it kind of still comes full circle like that. And it makes me wonder, like, if you didn't follow those societal expectations from the beginning, would
Would I
this
have
have
been a
always been
coach?
Yeah, like, did
I
you still end
honestly
up
don't
here?
think so. I think I still would have ended up, I do think I would have ended up in a career path that was more aligned,
Mhm.
but I do still feel like I would have, like, honestly, this wasn't on my radar at all.
Yeah,
Speaking, coaching, having a business, doing any of the stuff that I do in my life right now, I didn't know you could do that as a
me either.
career.
Yeah.
So I don't think this is what I would have ended up doing organically. I think I would have ended up doing something that, honestly, it's so hard to even think about. I think I would have ended up, and people have said this to me. I blew my knee out a lot when I was a kid. I have a soccer. I got injured a lot playing soccer. I feel like if I'd done it differently, I still would have ended up in something medical adjacent. I think I would have ended up doing sports medicine or like physical therapy. And I think I would have found a lot of fulfillment in doing that. So in a lot of ways, I'm kind of grateful that I went on the path that I was on, because I don't think I would have found coaching or speaking in any other way. Like maybe I would have, maybe it's, fate and I would have ended up here regardless, but I don't think I would have pursued coaching directly. If I didn't pursue this other thing, I maybe would have picked psychology, but I actually hated my Psych 101 class. I thought it was boring. And now I think psych is super interesting. And I kind of wish I'd gone down that path. And then it would have been a much more logical transition to then go into the work that I do now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like it's one of those things that, like, this is so much more accepted now to be an entrepreneur, to make money online. It seems like a viable career path for like a lot of students nowadays. And I don't think it was back when I was in school. So in a lot of ways, I'm grateful for the path I took because it
Yeah.
taught me science, which I think is really a helpful thing in the path I'm currently on. So like, I'm not mad about it, but
Yeah.
I also don't know that my inner child knew any different. Like, I don't even know that, like, I never wanted to be a soccer player. I never wanted to be, I think there was a part of me that would be like, oh, I want to be the next Sarah Bareilles or whatever. But like, I never actually wanted that because I wanted those things to just be fun. And I was actually
Mm.
really relieved when I stopped playing soccer competitively and I could just play soccer for fun. So a lot of the kind of like harebrained child paths that I could have gone down, I actually feel like I didn't go down them for a very deliberate reason.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's such a good point. And I don't know when you were going through high school. I graduated high school in 2007. So
Dude, we
coaching was like,
graduated the same year.
did we? Oh my God, I love it. That's amazing. Just look at this. Look at all these parallels. But yeah,
It's
you're
kind of
right.
creepy, actually.
Yeah, but like coaching wasn't a thing. Like nobody talked about that.
No,
Nobody talked about therapy either, which is also
no.
probably why psychology felt like, okay, like this is great. Like, how am I ever going to use
Yeah.
this? It's like for me, it was interesting, but I don't think I ever considered it something that I would actually go into, right? Because it like
Mhm.
it wasn't talked about. Like nobody went to therapy.
Yeah, I honestly feel like the biggest issue is that I didn't know myself when I was younger. I
Mm,
actually used, and I honestly, I don't disagree with this. I used to say all the time, I never want to go into medicine and be a doctor because I don't want to work with patients all day. I literally didn't think I wanted to work with people, which is
mm.
super ironic because now I work with people all the time. But I also literally told my dad at one point in time that I didn't want to go to take your daughter to work day with him because he just does homework all day. And guess what I do when I'm not coaching? I'm a professional tutor and I literally do homework with my students. So, like, I don't think I knew myself in any
Yeah.
way, shape, or form until I hit like my mid 20s. And then I was just like, wait, no, I actually really do enjoy this. Like, this is actually really fun. Working with people injects some fun novelty in what could otherwise be really, really monotonous work. But maybe
Yeah.
that's where the conversation comes in, is why didn't I know myself enough to know that I actually liked these things? And maybe it does come full circle back to the fact that I was trying so hard to please the people around me that it didn't really matter who I was and what I wanted.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. And I feel like that's a huge part of not knowing yourself, right?
Yeah.
Is you're always and when you're a teenager, you kind of you like know what you like and you lean into it, but you are really heavily influenced by others. And
Hmm.
that influence does continue as an adult, right? And then
Yeah.
the next thing you know, I had somebody ask me not that long ago. I mean, this was a year or so ago, like, what do you want? And I was like, oh, the house, the car, the kids. And then I was like, and he's like, no, like what do you actually want? And I was like, oh shit. I don't know. I have no idea, right? And so it like has sent
Mhm.
me on this big journey of like asking me what I want. And it's interesting because the more of that I figure out, the closer I get to who I am. And then I'm more sure in myself. I can connect with people better. I can
Yeah.
serve my clients better. Like my message has shifted in my coaching. Like so many things have come just
Yeah.
from that question. But it's such a good point because we don't a lot of times know what we want because we think we do because we're like, well, that's what they say we're supposed to
Mhm.
have. We're
Mhm.
supposed to have the career and the title and the kids and the marriage and like all of the things. And it's interesting because when you do know yourself better, you're like, oh, wait, maybe I don't actually want that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what's really hard too for somebody who is a high achiever, somebody who is a people pleaser, who is very externally validated, is I have developed over the course of my life, and it's a superpower, but it's also a massive curse. I can muster enthusiasm for just about anything. Like it is a superpower of mine. Like I can
Mhm.
convince myself I really, really enjoy something when the fact of the matter is I might be externally being influenced into that enjoyment. Like I enjoy it because I'm dating somebody who enjoys it, or I enjoy it because I have a friend who really enjoys it. And I don't think that's bad that you can kind of adapt yourself and mold yourself to fit into these various scenarios. I've called it for like a decade now. I always call it like the chameleon identity. I feel like a lot of us are chameleons in how we adapt to our world. But the problem becomes when your very ability to muster enthusiasm for these things starts to confuse even you. And I think
Mhm.
that's where I got in trouble is I convinced myself I loved a lot of things that I didn't actually love because of the external influences in my life. And I think the biggest thing for me was doing a shit ton of personal growth when I was in graduate school. Like finding coaching unlocked this whole realm of self-help and personal growth and just professional development and personal development and books and podcasts. And I'd never done any of that prior to that time when I was in grad school. And I'm really, this is why I literally said I just turned 35 and I did 35 lessons in 35 years. And one of the very first thing I post is I do believe that burnout is the best thing that ever happened to me because burnout led me to question everything about my reality, everything about how I was showing up and everything about how I was living. And I'm really grateful for that. Like I don't regret that at all. The only thing I regret is honestly that it didn't happen sooner because I wish
Mhm.
I'd been doing this for longer.
Oh my gosh. I think about that all the time too. I'm like, man, if I had figured this out when I was like 25,
Mhm.
27. Like I know everybody says that. Like I wish I knew then what I know now. And that's
Mhm.
great. And I think there are some people who are in their 20s now who are like really starting to figure this stuff out.
Yeah.
Like they're not drinking, they're asking themselves the right questions, all of those things. And I think it's really great, but it makes me wish like, oh man, like I know I've got plenty of life and ahead of me
Yeah.
that I get to enjoy now because I don't people please anymore and I know how to ask questions and I know what I want and
Mhm.
you know,
But
it,
you
it
also have to be like willing to step into the identity shift, I think. Because when I had
yeah.
this aha, it was in 2017. I left graduate school in 2017. I was in my late 20s. I discovered it's been 10 years since I discovered coaching, and I resisted it for 2 to 3 years after initially discovering it. No, that can't be my path. That can't be the road I'm supposed to walk down. Because what about this entire other path that I put all of this energy and this effort into? There's that like sunk cost fallacy that I think we can sometimes get like stuck in of I've already done all of this work. I can't leave that behind now. I can't say no to that now. And there's definitely some truth to that. I think we can use that as an excuse because we're scared of what the identity shift's going to look like. And we're scared of what is it going to mean to let this part of my identity go? Like even after dropping out of grad school, it took me another year and a half to fully be able to separate myself from the fact that I'm not a scientist anymore. Like that was rough. And I think that's a part of why sometimes, even if you do have that aha in your 20s, maybe it doesn't really like click until your 30s because you're not willing to let go of that identity. You're not willing to like step into like a scarier identity that maybe you're less certain of how the people around you are going to respond to or how you are even going to respond to it. That identity component was massive for me. And I think it's part of the reason why it took me so long. I had to like tiptoe out of it. I had to like tiptoe out of science and the discomfort of not being a scientist anymore. Cause that had been like, think about it. If we think about like when you're graduating from high school, it's okay, where you're going to college, what are you going to major in? Your entire identity of college is what's your major. And then when you leave college, your entire identity after that is what do you do? Like, what do you do for work? What's your profession? Like, I literally had up until that point, even though I was only 27, I'd had a decade plus of having my identity wrapped up in science. And to then step away from that was terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can relate. I had a similar experience. And this was actually probably not even a year ago now. And for me, it wasn't so much like my career identity because I couldn't wait to get away from hospitality. When I was working for other people, I could not wait to do that. But for me, it was like stepping out of the identity of like having to stay closed off and emotionally protected and like tight and be like, okay, well, somebody is going to hurt me, right? And I'm just going to get here like really vulnerable for a second and like not be able to like open up to people and like share with them like what it was I wanted at the deepest level, or like to actually openly express myself emotionally around people. And like even in relationships, romantic relationships that I've had in the past, I felt like I couldn't actually open up immediately. And I was just talking to somebody about this the other day. It felt like I was kind of like external from myself. And I would be like, oh, there's like so much emotion happening around me and I feel it and I want to feel it. And I'm like, why can't I express it? Like, am I broken? Right. And so as I started to explore that, it was like the same thing where it was like an identity I didn't want to let go of, where I was like, okay, there's this old version of myself that I have to make the decision to let go of in order to move forward, in order to be the best version of myself for me and for others, for my clients, like for my business, so many different things. And it was like I couldn't let go of like that girl who felt wounded, who felt like people were always going to leave her or always going to judge her for various different experiences in my life. And so for me, that's kind of how what you're saying resonates with me. And I have recently been able to let go of that, like very recently, like within the last year, to let go of that piece, because I've been doing the work, but then it's just, you know, there's certain pieces of us that we hang on to, and it's out of fear. At least for me, that's what I figured out is like, it's that fear of letting go of that identity because you don't know what's on the other side. And so for me, it's
100%.
like, well, if I let go of that, then I'm really opening up myself to be hurt. I'm really opening up myself to like test my boundaries and to have to communicate those things. But I will say that it is the best thing that I've ever done. And my life just feels so much more connected and vibrant and like all of these things that I've wanted since I've done that. So I love that you brought that up. It's interesting.
Yeah. And I think it's especially true with what you're talking about when you have, I mean, I'm a former scientist, when you have data to support the fear and you have data to support the concern of, if I open up, people are going to judge me. People are not going to accept me. When I started stepping into coaching in graduate school, I was still in graduate school while I was kind of experimenting with this. There was a lot of acceptance, but our brains naturally are going to gravitate toward the like negative experiences. There was a lot of acceptance of that. There was a lot of support of that, but there was also multiple instances where I kind of got like, for lack of a better, I don't throw this term around lightly and I always hesitate to use it in a platform like this, but frankly, it felt like bullying. There were multiple instances of that because I was going down that path. So that was like, here's a data point of if I, do something that's authentic to me, I'm going to get rejected. And then even when I dropped out of graduate school, my dad outright said, everything a like high achieving, people pleasing, like daddy's girl does not want to hear. My dad outright said, I'm disappointed when I left my PhD program. So it's like I had all of these examples of like acceptance and support, but my brain was latching on to the examples of the people who didn't and the people that I don't sugarcoat it all in this process. I'm so grateful for every decision I made, and I'm so grateful for making the jump and leaving that identity behind, but I don't sugarcoat it all. I lost very good friends. I had a very rocky relationship with my parents. I had to set some serious boundaries with my parents when I started my coaching business because they would say things that they were kind of saying them jokingly, but they were saying things that were super offensive about my business and the thing that I was building. It was hard. But the fact of the matter was, even I wouldn't trade that for anything because I have such an authentic relationship with my parents now, and their support feels genuine because it doesn't feel fake to me anymore. I'm not, smiling and accepting it because this fake part of me that just wants to be validated is like, oh, they're telling me I did a good job. It feels so different because it's validation that I actually want, and validation that actually is in line with my own like internal validation as well. So like, I don't sugarcoat with this that like shit's going to go down sometimes when you make an identity shift, but that's okay. Like, sometimes I love the notion. I have a tattoo on my back that's literally like this, like setbacks happen. They have to happen for us to move forward. And I'm grateful for those kind of moments of that were relationships that were challenging that I had to navigate in this transition as well.
Yeah. So, what would you say to somebody who's listening who deals with all these people pleasing tendencies and they're like really resonating with everything we're talking about? Like, how do they start to set those boundaries and just communicate what their needs are as they kind of step into themselves?
Mm-hmm. I would say the first thing is you have to have like radical self-awareness. Awareness really is the first step, because I feel like one of the reasons people don't know what boundaries to set, or one of the reasons people are kind of stuck in this funk of realizing like I need to set boundaries, I need to make this identity shift, but I don't know what that is. Like, I don't even know what I want here. That self-awareness piece is missing. And the only way a high achiever, for them to create self-awareness, is you got to slow the hell down. You got to slow the hell down, and you got to make space to create that self-awareness. And it can look like so many different things. I can give you kind of my like self-awareness toolbox, if you will. I know a lot of people are anti-meditation. I'm very pro meditation, but for very practical reasons. I'm very not woo-woo about it. I feel like what meditation gave me is meditation, was one of the only times in my day where I didn't have expectations of myself. I didn't expect myself to do anything or accomplish anything. It was literally a time where the whole goal was to sit my butt on a cushion and do nothing and attempt to, this is how I initially went into it, attempt to turn my brain off. So the expectations were, this is my one time a day where you're not producing and doing. Just don't, just sit in nothingness and just accept it. That was the first thing, is it trained me to be okay with having that time in my day. But the second thing that it gave me is it taught me that I don't have to respond to every freaking thought I have. I actually don't think the goal of meditation anymore is to turn your brain off. I think the goal of meditation now is to not react to every single thought you have. And that was a beautiful thing as well. But what was really cool about it is I used to couple meditation with journaling. So I would meditate, I would see where my brain went, I would see what came up as I was meditating, and then I would go journal on whatever it was that came up. And I didn't do any sort of structured journaling. I would journal however long I felt like journaling that day on whatever the hell topic I wanted to journal on. And honestly, sometimes my journal entry started with, I don't know what the hell to write about today, but I feel like I need to write, so I'm just going to start writing. Like, I would literally start a journal entry that way. So like that helped. But probably the biggest thing that helped for me is every single day I sit down and I do what I call a weekly review. I've also heard it called a stress inventory. It's got a lot of different names, but basically I sit down and I will usually do it over like a cup of coffee Monday morning or a glass of wine sometime over the weekend. And I just ask myself what's working, what's not working, and what can I improve? Very, very simply, those three questions. And what that started pointing out for me is, it showed me all of the things that I was doing right and that I felt really good about in my life, which was another just self-awareness building activity in and of itself, to realize, oh my God, I'm actually doing things right. Like, go me. I'm not always sucking at everything like I might feel like I am. But it also helped me make these little like course corrections in how I was showing up at work, how I was showing up for my health, how I was showing up in my relationships. And that's the beauty of an exercise like this. You can apply it to like so many parts of your life, which I love. So like that, I think, is step one. You've got to have radical self-awareness, because if you don't, you're not going to know what boundaries are being violated and therefore what boundaries need to be put in place. And as you're doing this, look for the places where, like, literally, if we think of what a boundary is, the quite literal definition of a boundary is like, it's like a fence. It's like literally a demarcation of, this is where this property ends and this is where this property begins. And quite literally, when a boundary violation is when somebody has overstepped that line. So like, if you are feeling yourself being like, they crossed a line, or you're feeling yourself getting pissed off, those are the boundary violations, those things that stir negative emotions in us. So that's also where the self-awareness comes in, of knowing what are the instances this week where this felt like there was a line that was crossed or the boundary that was violated. So it starts with that radical self-awareness. And then once we build that radical self-awareness, we can get very, very clear on why is the boundary being violated? Usually it comes down to some sort of a values conflict. And then we can get clear on like who's the culprit, who's the offender that is violating said boundary. And then we can navigate what is the new boundary that we want, and then we can navigate how to communicate it. But it all starts with this just like radical self-awareness. We have to be really, really aware of what is feeling violating to us. And most of us can't articulate that. We can do it in maybe some sort of like a nebulous way, but most of us can't articulate what it is that feels like the boundary violation for us. That's why that creating that space and creating that self-awareness is so stupidly important. Because honestly, a good chunk of the time from what I see from clients, the boundary that they think is being violated is not actually the boundary that's being violated.
Yeah. There's like always another layer to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
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 Like if I think about it, like an example that I like to use a lot, and I honestly use this in speaking occasions quite frequently. A very like it's a business example, but it's also like an identity shift and a personal example. It's very related to what we've been talking about. When I left graduate school and I was starting to build my business, my parents used to kind of say, like they would, I don't remember exactly how they said it, but they would kind of refer to my business as if like it was not a real job. Like, when are you going to get a real job? And understandably, it pissed me off. Because here I am, I was in a situation where, coaching or not, I had made this decision to leave graduate school and I was making way better money doing what I was doing while I was building my business on the side. I was way more fulfilled. I was way happier. I had like way more freedom. I started working remotely since before it was cool. Like, I've been working remotely for a very long time. And I felt so happy about the decision I made. There's never been one part of me that's regretted dropping out of graduate school, except maybe the minuscule part of me that's like, being Dr. Ellyn would be really cool though. Yeah. But like, here I am so happy. And I was so frustrated that they kept using this phrase. And so, but I started to realize I'd done a lot of values work at that point. I started to realize that the reason why I was so frustrated is it violated my fundamental, what I call my relational boundary, or my relational value, excuse me, which is about belonging. Like, my value isn't family or friends or anything. My value is belonging. Because when I have true authenticity and vulnerability with my relationships, that's what I feel. I feel fundamentally like I have belonging with the people in my life, no matter where that belonging comes from. And when they were saying this, that's what it felt like. It felt like, here's this place where I should belong and I should be accepted and I should be loved unconditionally, and I don't feel that. And that's why it made me realize why it was so important for me to address this with them. Why I couldn't just ignore it as some snide little comment. I had to articulate to them, not to say it, which is also a super, super important part of boundaries. You cannot think boundaries into existence. You have to like communicate them with people. Mm-hmm. Like, it gave me so much more context for why it was important for me to communicate it. And it gave me so much more context as I was explaining to them why it wasn't okay. Like, I feel like sometimes we have to have that personal context first before we can really expect others to understand our boundaries and to support our boundaries.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, because if you can't back up your own argument, mm-hmm. right, you can't just say, because I said so. I mean, in theory, yes, if like I'm setting a boundary and I'm saying don't do that because I don't like it, that should be mm-hmm. enough. But in some situations, right, you do need to be able to come from a place of love, right? And mm-hmm. just be like, hey, like, I understand where you're coming from. This is where I'm coming from, and here's why, and be able to explain that value. And so I think that I love that. I think I mean, obviously I don't need to tell you that you're spot on with that, right? But like, to be able to know why you feel a certain way about something, mm-hmm. because when you can do that, then if somebody else isn't understanding your viewpoint, for you to be able to explain it to where they can be like, oh, I can mm-hmm. see that, or I didn't realize that it affected you that way, right? Because mm-hmm. I'm a firm believer that everybody in the world is doing the best they can with the tools that they have, right?
Same.
And it's everybody's view and lens of the world is so different. Their experiences are so different. Like, especially like looking at our parents, right? Like, they grew up in a different time. So they, right? And they value, like the steadiness, the consistency, what's going to keep us safe, right? And so I'm sure, without knowing the personal dynamic with your parents, so hopefully I'm not speaking out of turn when I say this, but like, they wanted to keep you safe, right?
Oh, 100%. And I think you're bringing a really important point that I think needs to be in the conversation when it comes to setting boundaries, taking the other person's perspective. Like I have a whole, when I do speaking and when I'm working with clients and all of my like courses and shit that I offer on my website, one of my favorite things to teach is this boundary setting script. And the first part of it is to take perspective, like to acknowledge. And honestly, I say always start with positive intent and then take perspective. And in this situation, like the positive intent in that situation was I knew I was so grateful and appreciative of how much they'd supported me when I left graduate school. They'd actually helped they gave me a little bit of money to offset some of the moving costs. Like I lived with them when I got back. Like in so many respects, they were so tremendously supportive. And I started with that when I started this conversation, is telling them how much I appreciated all the support that they'd given me. And then I also, just like you said, took their perspectives. Like I explained to them what the boundary violation was. I don't appreciate you guys saying this. But then I also said, like, I completely understand that it wasn't your intention to make me feel this way. And I understand that you're coming from a lens of, I want you to be safe, and I don't necessarily understand the journey that you're on. I think I had to acknowledge that as well, because I think when you kind of frame the boundary and the ask that you're making in that perspective, people are so much less on the defensive because they feel like you've actually put the energy and the effort into trying to understand where they're coming from. But simultaneously with that, there's a part of the boundary setting script that I talk about where there's some boundaries that I think are negotiable boundaries and some boundaries that aren't. And there's always a question that I will ask of like, how does that sound to you if it is a negotiable boundary? If it's a boundary that you really do need to find like a good middle ground that both people can buy into, because some boundaries are truly negotiable. So that's why I have that question in there. But there's some situations where I don't give a shit how that sounds to you. This is my boundary. Don't violate it. And that was an example where I really don't care if you guys think it's okay to refer to my business as not a real job. Don't say it anymore. I don't care how this sounds to you. This is the boundary. It's like being yelled at, like having your voice raised, or like, I don't know, like physical violence. Like there are some things that like, I don't give a shit how this sounds to you. It's not okay. Don't do it anymore. And this was one of those things for me because fundamentally it was violating one of my core values. And one of the things that I depend a lot on my parents for, which is belonging. I do have a good relationship with my parents, but yeah, that was one of those things that we had a little butting heads moment over it. And the beautiful thing was, not only did they never said this to me since, but it actually opened up an awesome dialogue about where I was at, what my vision was, what my plan was to get to a point where I was safe and supported and had security in my life while I built this. My business turned 5 in January of this year. And I'm just taking my business full time because security and stability are important to me too. Like I wasn't about to dive into this and be like, I don't know where my income's coming from, but that's okay. Like I just don't roll that way. So yeah.
Yeah. No, and I love that. And again, similar experience, not exactly the same, but you know, I had a really uncomfortable boundary setting conversation with my dad, and it wasn't necessarily not like saying don't say this and don't say this to me, but as I was letting go of that version of myself, just I think 6 months ago, I actually called my dad and I said, "Hey, I want you to know that like these are the things that you said or you did as a child to me that affect me now. These are the things that turned me into this people-pleasing, overachieving person who is in meetings with multimillionaires and freezing up in meetings when they're asking me things because I'm like, oh my God, don't see me. Or I'm so focused on like you liking me and you thinking that I'm smart that all of a sudden the answer that I knew is gone from my mind the second that you ask me, right? And so that's kind of the place that I was sitting in, and like, again, so tight and like not able to open up because I always was like trying to get acceptance from my dad and like being good enough. And then and then again, been collecting for years this data where I'm like, oh, maybe I'm being bullied here in this workplace, and I have been, and you know, all of these things. And so I realized I like have to have a conversation with my dad about this and just even just like let it go. Right. And just be like, hey, you know, I just want you to know, because I don't want to have to go my whole life like hanging on to this. And honestly, like having the resentment of like, like this is the person that I've become because of this, and to
Mm-hmm.
be able to like develop beyond that, right? Because you can only develop so far when you're still holding on to those things because you haven't created those new boundaries, or you haven't healed those pieces of you that you need
Mm-hmm.
to, in order to again have that self-awareness of like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I'm actually taking the time to recognize this, set it down, let
Mm-hmm.
it go, and then move on. Because then once I did that and I had this conversation with my dad, and by the way, I was terrified to do this. So if anybody's
Yes.
listening to this and they're like, holy shit, I could never do that, I was terrified. I thought my dad was going to shut down, not say a word, and find an excuse to get off the phone. And he was actually like very open. I was actually very
Mm-hmm.
surprised when I came at it from a loving perspective and I took the time to think about what his experience was and how he was doing the best that he could as a dad. And
Yeah.
I knew how he was raised and how my grandparents were raised. And so I knew he didn't have the tools going in, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so to be able to appreciate that, and then hear him saying those same things and being open with me and saying, hey, like I did the best that I could with the tools that I knew how. And I'm
Yeah.
so sorry for the way this affected you. Like for me, that really, really helped me to be okay and to own with my identity the experiences that I have in a different way, in a new way, to where it makes me feel more empowered to have had that experience because I've been able to have that conversation. I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel like there's a lot of power in the
Absolutely.
way that I set boundaries now because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also feel like I want to kind of give a flip side of it because I feel like we've given two examples where it was a hard boundary to set and it was a hard conversation to have, and it ended up working out positively. I
Yeah.
want to give another example of when people aren't receptive
Yes, please do.
and
When it goes
what
sideways.
happens, because I feel like I think this is the thing that we need to understand with people who are people pleasing. I like to think that I am a recovering perfectionist, and I feel like for the most part I am a recovered people pleaser. I feel like this was a wonderful thing about hitting my early 30s. I honestly feel like this started a couple years ago. I just turned 35. I feel like this started maybe around 33, where I just genuinely started not to give a shit anymore. But the place where there are times there that I've had to set boundaries with people who weren't receptive to the boundary that I was setting. And it was also family. And it was actually in relation to body image and body issues. So we are going to go there. I've struggled with body image my entire life because I have had family my entire life make comments about me being overweight. It started when I was a preteen. My great grandma told me that I was fat. And when I was a teenager, my dad and I'm very understanding of where this came from with my dad, but it did boil down to as a teenager that my daddy thinks I'm fat. Like that's what it boiled down
Mhm.
to. But he was saying it from the context of you're playing competitive soccer. It would probably benefit you to lose a little bit of weight. It would make you faster. It would make you a better soccer player. Like I know where he was coming from when he said it, but teenage me, all I heard is my daddy thinks I'm fat. So
Mhm.
that happened. I went on Weight Watchers out of college, and I vividly remember one of my aunts telling me the whole nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. And it happened as recently as a couple years ago, where my grandma randomly in a conversation that was completely unrelated to me and my weight all of a sudden just came out of nowhere and said, yeah, you could use a little, you could lose some weight too. Like literally 2 years ago. My grandma's 90, so she's like in that age range where she genuinely does not give a shit about what she says. She just comes to
Mhm.
her brain, goes out of her mouth. Like she's at that age where she feels like she can get away with it. And I was so, and I'm bringing this up because these are things where I still carry this. I still struggle with body image. It's probably the thing that I will struggle with for the rest of my life, but I'm in a much better place about it than I was a decade ago, for sure, 5 years ago, for sure.
Mhm.
And I was so proud of myself in this moment because she said this to me during this phone call. And I immediately went to what we just did. I was like, Grandma, I get why you're saying that, but I also just don't appreciate it. And please don't make comments about my weight. You have no right to. You don't know my health. Please don't make comments about my weight. And it was another one of those situations where I was just like, I don't give a fuck what you think. Um, this is not okay. And I'm not going to ask how this sounds to you. Um, and she doubled down. She's like, well, what do you mean? Well, like, blah, blah, blah. And she kept saying it. She's like, well, I genuinely think this and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, Grandma, I don't care that you think this. Don't say this anymore. And if you keep talking about it, I'm going to hang up on you. Like my, at the time, 88-year-old grandma, like the whole respect your elders thing was out the window for me. I was just like, this is not okay. If you keep commenting on this, I'm going to hang up on you. And she kept commenting on it and I hung up on her. And you know what? Every time I hang out with her, she literally took me to dinner on my birthday on Tuesday. Every time I hang out with her, there's a part of my brain that still goes to, is this going to be another moment where I'm going to have to shut this down? Is this, because it doesn't feel like a safe place anymore, especially with that part of my life and my experience. But I also know now, at the very least, that I have faith in myself that I can set the boundary and shut it down. It's, family is tricky because she's always, until she kicks the bucket, which I don't know if it's going to be anytime soon, because she's got all the energy in the world. She's going to be in my life until she dies. And I have such wonderful memories with her as a child that I don't think that love that I have for her is ever going to go away. But what I do, and I'm always going to still spend time with her and still be with her. But what I know now is that when this comes up, I can trust myself to shut it down. And honestly, I already told myself, that it came up at dinner on Tuesday, because it was just us two at dinner on Tuesday, that I was going to ask for the check and pay for dinner and take her home, even if it was in the middle of the meal. I already knew that going into it. I knew how I was going to approach the situation, because at that point, it was about me protecting myself and taking care of myself. So I bring that up because all of us are going to be put in situations where we have to set boundaries with people who aren't going to be receptive to setting boundaries, and for people who are likely going to continue violating those boundaries. And yeah, in a perfect world, we would say, cool, we don't have to see those people ever again. But I think a good chunk of the time for a lot of us, it's family. And that's a complicated place to set a boundary, especially when the ideal situation would be that you never have to deal with that person again. But oftentimes we are going to have to deal with that person again. And I think it's about, after you do it once, it builds such confidence and such faith in yourself that you know you can uphold the difficult boundary in the difficult situation. And you just have to kind of go in from there, that point forward, knowing that you can do that again, and having that trust and that faith in yourself that you can do it again if you need to.
Yeah. Yeah. So good. And thank you for sharing that, so we can cover both sides of the spectrum, because that is the reality, is that sometimes these goal setting, or you're not goal setting, your boundary setting, sometimes it doesn't work out the way you want to. But at the end of the day, it's about standing up for yourself and coming up with a plan. Like you having a backup plan, I think is amazing. And so I would encourage anybody who's listening, like if it doesn't go well, just figure out like how can you still stand in your own power and stand up for yourself, because at the end of the day, you're the only person that you have.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
I think that's what I've been single for a really long time. So I know that like I can be my best friend or my own worst enemy. And I think when it comes to boundaries, what I've gotten to the point of is I have to be my own safe space. Even if I can't always count on people around me to be that safe space, I can be my own safe space. And I think that's what my reframe around boundaries has been, is I'm not doing it to be an asshole and to be difficult to people. I'm trying to create a safe space for myself to operate in this world. And sometimes that does mean having to piss people off in the process. And we can have this like unicorns and rainbows versions of setting boundaries, but the fact of the matter is it doesn't always work like that. But that doesn't mean the boundary doesn't need to be set. I always say there's a big difference between irresponsibility and boundaries. And there's a big difference between like being a bad granddaughter or a bad daughter and having boundaries. I feel like sometimes the whole good daughter, be a good girl mentality means that we act like we're just going to let people run all over us, and we just can't do that. We have to create our own safe space. We have to be our own best friend, and we have to create that for ourselves. And I think that's what boundaries really does. I went on a tangent with boundaries, but hey.
No, it's so important. It is so, so, so important. So thank you for sharing that. And if anybody listening, Ellen, can't get enough of you, which I'm sure they can't, and they want to stay connected.
I can't believe we're already done.
I know. It's been so fast. I love your content. And so I'm confident that anyone following me would love your content as well. So if they want to stay connected with you, how would they connect?
Yeah, I am Coach Ellen everywhere. My name is spelled Ellyn. So Coach Ellyn. I'm on Coach Ellen on Instagram. I am CoachEllen.com is my website. I am also have a YouTube channel, which should also be Coach Ellen. Yeah, honestly, if you Coach Ellen basically on any platform, you will find me.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being here. This was an amazing conversation and definitely one we could continue. So maybe we'll have to have you back for part two
Part
so we
two.
can keep going. But thank you so much for being here and sharing space with the Rebel Rise community. It's been awesome having you.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Rebel Rise podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode and invite your friends to join us next week. This is your time. Now get out there and rise.